I never thought a piece of paper could destroy a family, but that's exactly what happened the day I found Grandma Rose's letter. The envelope was tucked between the pages of her old recipe book, yellowed with age and bearing my name in her careful handwriting, to my granddaughter, Hannah only. At 17, I'd grown used to being overlooked in favor of my older brother Jake, so finding something meant specifically for me felt like discovering buried treasure. The house in Missoula had been eerily quiet since the funeral 3 days ago, filled with the kind of silence that follows death, heavy, suffocating, and somehow permanent. My parents had been going through Grandma's belongings with the efficiency of people trying to get through a painful task as quickly as possible. Mom would pick up each item, examine it briefly, then either place it in the keep pile or the donate box with mechanical precision. Dad mostly stood by the window, staring out at the Montana mountains that Grandma had loved so much, his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was fighting back tears. They'd loved her deeply, I knew that, but there was something else in their behavior, a nervous energy, like they were searching for something specific while hoping they wouldn't find it. The envelope felt substantial in my hands, not like a simple greeting card or note. Whatever was inside had weight to it, both literally and figuratively. I could sense that much. I ran my fingers over Grandma's handwriting, remembering how she used to write me little notes when I was younger, hiding them in my lunchbox or under my pillow. My special girl, she used to call me, and I'd always felt that bond between us was different from what she shared with Jake, or even my parents. There was an understanding there, an unspoken connection that made me feel less alone in a family where I often felt like an outsider looking in. Standing in her bedroom, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and old books that had always defined Grandma Rose, I made the decision to open the envelope right then and there. My parents were downstairs arguing about what to do with her china cabinet, their voices carrying up through the floorboards in sharp, clipped tones that suggested this wasn't really about furniture at all. I slipped my finger under the envelope's seal, feeling the old glue give way with a soft tearing sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and something else, something that made my heart skip a beat the moment I saw it. The letter was written in Grandma's familiar script, but the words were unlike anything she'd ever said to me before. "My dearest Hannah," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it's time you knew the truth about who you really are." My hands started trembling as I continued reading, each word hitting me like a physical blow. She wrote about secrets that had been kept from me, about a man named Stephen who was supposedly my real father, about lies that had shaped my entire existence. The room seemed to spin around me as I absorbed the implications of what she was telling me, my whole world shifting on its axis in the space of a few paragraphs. But it was the photograph that truly shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. The man in the picture looked exactly like me. The same dark hair, the same unusual green eyes, the same stubborn chin that I'd always been told came from Dad's side of the family. Except this wasn't Dad. This was Stephen according to the note on the back, and he was holding a baby that could only be me. The resemblance was so striking it was impossible to deny, and suddenly every awkward family moment, every time I'd felt like I didn't quite fit, every whispered conversation that stopped when I entered a room, all of it made terrible, perfect sense. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that photograph and rereading the letter, but eventually I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mom's voice called out, asking if I'd found anything interesting up there, and I quickly shoved the letter and photo back into the envelope. Something in her tone made me hesitate about sharing my discovery immediately. There was a forced casualness to her question that set off alarm bells in my head. Instead, I called back that I was just looking through some old books, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I needed time to process this information, to figure out what it meant and what I was going to do about it. As I heard my parents' footsteps retreating back downstairs, I sat on Grandma's bed and tried to make sense of everything. The letter had ended with a warning that chilled me to the bone. "Be careful who you trust with this information, my darling girl. Some secrets are kept for good reasons, but others are kept to protect the guilty." What had Grandma meant by that? Who was Stephen, really? And why had my parents never told me about him? More importantly, why had Grandma felt the need to hide this truth until after her death? The envelope felt like it was burning in my hands, containing answers to questions I'd never even known I should be asking. and I had the sinking feeling that once I started pulling at this thread, my entire life was going to unravel. The next morning came too soon, bringing with it a tension I'd never felt in our house before. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and turning Grandma's words over in my mind like stones I was trying to polish smooth. Every creak of the old house made me jump, and I kept the envelope hidden under my mattress like some kind of contraband. When I finally dragged myself downstairs for breakfast, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table in an uncomfortable silence that felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Mom was stirring her coffee with mechanical precision, the spoon clinking against the ceramic in a rhythm that seemed almost frantic, while Dad stared at his untouched toast like it held the secrets of the universe. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom said when she noticed me, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. There was something different about the way she looked at me, a searching quality that made me feel like she was trying to read my thoughts. I mumbled a greeting and poured myself a bowl of cereal, hyper-aware of every movement I made under their scrutiny. The kitchen that had always felt warm and welcoming suddenly seemed foreign, like I was an intruder in my own home. Dad cleared his throat and asked if I'd finished going through Grandma's things upstairs, his voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on edge. I told him I had, keeping my own voice as level as possible while my heart hammered against my ribs. The lie came easier than I'd expected, sliding off my tongue like it belonged there. I watched my parents' faces carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign that they suspected I was hiding something. Mom's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, but Dad's jaw remained tight, and he kept glancing at Mom in a way that suggested they'd been discussing something before I came downstairs. The air in the kitchen felt charged with unspoken words and hidden meanings, like we were all actors in a play where everyone knew their lines except me. I found myself studying their faces with new eyes, looking for traces of deception or guilt, wondering how long they'd been lying to me about something so fundamental as my own identity. After breakfast, I escaped to my room under the pretense of doing homework, but really, I just needed space to think. I pulled out the envelope again and studied the photograph more closely, memorizing every detail of Stephen's face. The resemblance was undeniable. We had the same nose, the same way of holding our heads slightly tilted to the left, even the same small scar above the right eyebrow that I'd gotten from falling off my bike when I was 6. Or at least, that's the story my parents had always told me. Now, I wondered if that scar was something I'd inherited instead, a genetic marker that connected me to this stranger who might be my real father. The thought made my stomach churn, with a mixture of excitement and terror. I spent the afternoon researching Stephen online, using the few details from Grandma's letter as starting points. The internet yielded frustratingly little information. A few social media profiles that might or might not be the right person. Some business listings that could be relevant, but nothing concrete enough to build a clear picture. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and every dead end only made me more determined to find answers. I found myself becoming obsessed with small details, zooming in on profile pictures to look for familiar features, cross-referencing dates and locations, building elaborate theories that probably had no basis in reality, but felt important nonetheless. When my parents called me down for dinner, I noticed immediately that something had shifted in their dynamic. They were being overly cheerful, asking about my day with the kind of forced enthusiasm that parents use when they're trying to distract you from something. Mom had made my favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread, which should have been a comfort but instead felt like a bribe. Dad kept making jokes that weren't particularly funny, and both of them seemed to be working hard to fill every silence with chatter about mundane topics like the weather and neighborhood gossip. It was like they were performing the role of normal parents, but the performance felt hollow and desperate. The strangest part was how they kept looking at each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. These quick, meaningful glances that spoke of conversations I wasn't privy to, decisions being made without my input. I caught Mom staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part sadness, part fear, part something that looked almost like guilt. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away and asked if I wanted more bread, her voice pitched higher than usual. Dad was quieter than normal, responding to my comments with distracted nods and half-hearted smiles that didn't hide the worry lines creasing his forehead. As we cleared the dishes together, I made a decision that felt both brave and terrifying. I was going to confront them about the letter, about Stephen, about all the lies that seemed to be unraveling around us like a sweater with a pulled thread. But just as I opened my mouth to speak, Dad's phone rang with a call from his office, and Mom suddenly remembered she had to return a call to Aunt Sarah about funeral arrangements. The moment dissolved into ordinary chaos, and I was left standing in the kitchen with words burning in my throat and no one to hear them. That night, as I lay in bed listening to my parents' muffled voices through the walls, I realized that whatever conversation we needed to have, it was going to have to wait. But I also knew that waiting was becoming harder with each passing hour, and soon the truth was going to demand its due whether we were ready for it or not. 3 days passed before I worked up the courage to mention Stephen's name, and when I finally did, the reaction was immediate and devastating. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, the television providing background noise while Mom worked on a crossword puzzle and Dad pretended to read the newspaper. The normalcy of the scene felt like a lie, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I took a deep breath and said, as casually as I could manage, "Mom, do you remember anyone named Stephen from when I was born?" The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Mom's pen froze mid-word, Dad's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened around it, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. The silence that followed my question stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I watched my parents' faces transform from casual evening relaxation to something that looked like panic, their eyes meeting across the room in one of those loaded glances that had become so common lately. Mom was the first to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and fake as she asked why I was asking about someone named Stephen. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she set down her pen. Dad folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, his movements too careful, too measured, like he was buying time to think of the right response. "Just curious," I said, trying to match their casual tone while my heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. I found some old photos at Grandma's house, and there was a guy named Stephen in a few of them. I didn't recognize him from family gatherings or anything. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been a photo, after all. But it wasn't the whole truth either. I watched their faces carefully, looking for any crack in their composure, any sign that would confirm what I already suspected. Mom's smile became even more strained, and she suggested that Stephen was probably just an old friend of Grandma's, someone from her church or neighborhood that I wouldn't have met. The explanation was reasonable, but something in her tone made it sound rehearsed. Dad cleared his throat and added that Grandma had known a lot of people over the years, many of whom we'd never met as a family. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. He suggested that we shouldn't read too much into old photographs, that sometimes people appear in family pictures without being particularly significant to the family's story. The words were meant to be dismissive, but they had the opposite effect on me. If Stephen was truly insignificant, why were my parents working so hard to convince me of that fact? Why did the mere mention of his name seem to have triggered some kind of internal alarm system between them? I nodded and pretended to accept their explanation, but inside, I was filing away every micro-expression, every hesitation, every too-quick response. The conversation moved on to other topics, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. My parents were trying too hard to act normal, their laughter too loud, their interest in mundane topics too intense. Mom asked about my plans for the weekend with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for serious conversations about grades or college applications. Dad made several comments about how nice it was to have quiet family time, as if he was trying to reinforce the idea that our family was complete and perfect, just as it was. That night, I heard them talking in their bedroom long after they usually went to sleep. Their voices were too low for me to make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably serious and worried. I crept closer to their door, pressing my ear against the wood and straining to catch fragments of their conversation. I heard my name mentioned several times, along with words like careful and protect and not ready. At one point, Mom's voice rose slightly, and I caught the phrase, "She's asking questions," followed by Dad's deeper rumble, saying something about keeping things simple. The conversation went on for nearly an hour, and I stood in the hallway the entire time, my bare feet growing cold against the hardwood floor. The next morning brought a new level of awkwardness that seemed to permeate every interaction we had. My parents were being overly attentive, asking about my plans for the day with the kind of detailed interest that felt more like surveillance than parental concern. Mom offered to drive me to school even though I usually took the bus, and Dad suggested we plan a family movie night for the weekend, something we hadn't done in months. Their efforts to create normalcy were so obvious and desperate that they had the opposite effect, making me more suspicious than ever. I found myself analyzing every word they said, looking for hidden meanings and ulterior motives in the most innocent comments. By the time I got to school, I was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to navigate my own home. My best friend Jess noticed immediately that something was wrong, commenting that I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I wanted desperately to tell her everything, about the letter, about Stephen, about the way my parents were acting, but something held me back. Grandma's warning about being careful who to trust echoed in my mind, and I realized that I didn't know who was safe anymore. If my own parents had been lying to me for 17 years, how could I be sure that anyone else would tell me the truth? The isolation was crushing, but it felt necessary, like the only way to protect myself until I could figure out what was really going on. That afternoon, as I walked home from school instead of taking the bus, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find Stephen myself, with or without my parents' help. Finding Stephen turned out to be easier than I'd expected, but the truth he revealed was harder than anything I could have imagined. After days of online searching and cross-referencing the few clues from Grandma's letter, I finally found a Stephen Morrison who lived just 2 hours away in Billings and whose age matched what I'd calculated from the photograph. His social media profiles were sparse, but there was enough information to convince me this was the right person. My hands shook as I typed out a message explaining who I was and asking if we could meet, my finger hovering over the send button for nearly 10 minutes before I finally found the courage to press it. His response came within hours, and the words made my heart stop. "Hannah, I've been waiting 17 years for you to contact me." The drive to Billings felt like the longest 2 hours of my life, even though I'd convinced my parents I was spending the day at Jess's house working on a school project. Stephen had suggested we meet at a small cafe downtown, somewhere public where we could talk without drawing attention. I spotted him immediately when I walked in. The resemblance was even more striking in person, like looking at a masculine version of myself 25 years in the future. He stood up when he saw me, his face cycling through a dozen emotions in the span of seconds. Joy, sadness, regret, hope, and something that looked like fear. When he spoke my name, his voice cracked slightly, and I realized he was just as nervous about this meeting as I was. We sat across from each other in a corner booth, two strangers connected by blood and separated by years of secrets. Stephen ordered coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and I noticed he had the same habit I did of tapping his fingers against the table when he was thinking. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken questions and 17 years of missed conversations. Finally, he cleared his throat and said the words that confirmed what I'd already suspected. "You're my daughter, Hannah. I know your parents told you otherwise, but you're mine." The simple statement hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been preparing myself to hear it. Having my suspicions confirmed was entirely different from actually hearing the truth spoken aloud. Stephen's story unfolded slowly, punctuated by long pauses where he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. He told me about his relationship with my mother when they were both young and unmarried, about how they'd planned to raise me together until my father, the man I'd always called Dad, entered the picture. According to Stephen, my parents had convinced him that I would be better off in a stable, two-parent household with financial security, something he couldn't provide as a struggling artist in his early 20s. He'd agreed to step aside, believing it was the best thing for me, but he'd never stopped loving me or wondering about the daughter he'd given up. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, like a wound that had never properly healed. But the real bombshell came when Stephen explained why my parents had been so desperate to keep his identity secret. It wasn't just about protecting their family unit or avoiding awkward explanations about my parentage. Stephen had been involved in a car accident when I was 3 years old, an accident that had killed a young mother and her child. He'd been drinking that night, and although he'd served his time and rebuilt his life, my parents had used his criminal record as justification for cutting him out of my life completely. They'd convinced themselves, and apparently Grandma Rose, that I was better off never knowing about my biological father's past mistakes. The revelation made me feel sick to my stomach, not because of Stephen's history, but because of the way my parents had weaponized it to justify their deception. Stephen reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but desperate, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. He told me he'd been sober for 14 years, that he'd spent every day since the accident trying to make amends for what he'd done. He'd become a counselor for other people struggling with addiction, dedicating his life to preventing others from making the same mistakes he had. The man sitting across from me bore no resemblance to the reckless young person my parents had described in their whispered conversations. He was thoughtful, articulate, and clearly haunted by his past in a way that spoke to genuine remorse and growth. I found myself believing him, trusting him in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. As our conversation continued, Stephen showed me photographs he'd kept of me over the years, pictures he'd somehow obtained through mutual friends or distant relatives, documenting my growth from a distance like a guardian angel I'd never known existed. There were photos of me at school, plays, birthday parties, even my high school graduation ceremony that I didn't remember him attending. The realization that he'd been watching over me from afar all these years was both comforting and heartbreaking. He'd missed so much of my life, but he'd tried to be present in the only way my parents would allow. The love in his eyes as he looked at these pictures was unmistakable, and I felt a connection to him that I'd never experienced with the man I'd called father. When it was time to leave, Stephen hugged me with the desperate intensity of someone who wasn't sure when they'd see me again. He gave me his phone number and made me promise to call if I ever needed anything, no matter what my parents might say about him. As I drove home to Missoula, my mind was reeling with everything I'd learned. I had a father who loved me, who'd been forced out of my life by circumstances and choices that had nothing to do with his feelings for me. But I also had parents who'd built their entire relationship with me on a foundation of lies. And I had no idea how to reconcile those two realities. The worst part was knowing that when I walked through our front door, I'd have to pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still the same naive girl who'd believed their version of my story. But everything had changed, and there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance I'd lived in for 17 years. The confrontation with my parents happened 3 days after I met Stephen, and it was every bit as explosive as I'd feared it would be. I'd been carrying the weight of everything I'd learned like a stone in my chest, watching them go about their daily routines while knowing they were living a lie. The breaking point came during dinner when Dad made some offhand comment about how important it was for families to be honest with each other, and I couldn't take the hypocrisy anymore. I set down my fork with more force than necessary and said, "Like how you've been honest with me about Stephen Morrison." The effect was immediate and devastating. Mom's face went white as paper, Dad's jaw dropped open, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 3 rooms away. They knew in that moment that their carefully constructed world of secrets had finally crumbled, and there was no putting it back together. What followed was the most painful conversation of my life, filled with tears, accusations, and revelations that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Mom broke down first, sobbing as she tried to explain how they'd only wanted to protect me from Stephen's troubled past and give me a stable, loving home. Dad was more defensive, insisting that they'd made the right choice and that Stephen had forfeited his right to be my father the moment he'd gotten behind the wheel drunk and killed innocent people. They painted a picture of a dangerous, unstable man who would have ruined my life, but their words rang hollow against the memory of the gentle, remorseful person I'd met in that cafe in Billings. The Stephen they described bore no resemblance to the man who'd shown me years' worth of photographs and spoken about his sobriety with quiet pride. I realized that my parents had been telling themselves this story for so long that they'd started to believe their own propaganda, convincing themselves that their deception was noble rather than selfish. The argument escalated when I told them I'd already met Stephen, and I watched 17 years of careful planning disintegrate before their eyes. Dad's face turned red with anger as he demanded to know how I'd found him, what we'd talked about, whether Stephen had tried to turn me against them. Mom kept asking if Stephen had told me about the accident, about the people who'd died, as if she expected me to recoil in horror and beg their forgiveness for doubting them. But I stood my ground, telling them that yes, Stephen had told me everything, and that his honesty was refreshing after years of their lies. I explained that Stephen had taken responsibility for his mistakes, had spent 14 years making amends, had become a better person than either of them seemed capable of recognizing. The look of betrayal on their faces was almost comical. They were acting like I was the one who'd been dishonest, like I was the one who'd destroyed our family's trust. The conversation took an even darker turn when Mom revealed the real reason they'd been so desperate to keep Stephen away from me. Through her tears, she admitted that they'd been afraid I would choose him over them if I knew the truth, that I would see them as the villains who'd stolen me from my real father. Dad added that they'd built their entire marriage and family around the fiction that I was his biological daughter, and that acknowledging Stephen's existence would undermine everything they'd worked to create. Their fear was palpable and pathetic. Two adults who'd spent nearly 2 decades lying to a child because they couldn't face the possibility of losing her love. I felt a mixture of pity and rage as I listened to them justify their deception, realizing that their actions had never been about protecting me at all. They'd been protecting themselves, their image, their comfortable lie of a perfect family. As the argument wound down into exhausted silence, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told my parents that I loved them despite everything they'd done, but that I also loved Stephen and wanted him to be part of my life going forward. I explained that I was old enough to handle the complexity of having multiple parental figures, that I didn't need them to protect me from difficult truths anymore. The relief on their faces was immediate but fragile, like they couldn't quite believe I wasn't walking out of their lives forever. We talked until nearly midnight, establishing new boundaries and expectations for our relationship, acknowledging that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly and carefully. When I finally went to bed that night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because the situation was resolved, but because the truth was finally out in the open. I had 2 fathers now, one who'd raised me with love, but also with lies, and one who'd loved me from a distance, but with complete honesty. It wasn't the family structure I'd grown up expecting, but it was real, and that made it infinitely more valuable than the beautiful fiction I'd been living in for 17 years.